happens when American philosophy meets Indian social reform? How did a student from India transform pragmatist ideas to challenge the ancient caste system? Welcome to Adventures of a Bystander. Today we dive into a fascinating intellectual journey connecting American pragmatism with India's quest for social justice. I'm joined by Dr. Scott R. Stroud, Associate Professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and author of The Evolution of Pragmatism in India, Ambedkar, Dewey, and the Rhetoric of Reconstruction. Dr. Stroud's groundbreaking work explores how Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, one of India's founding fathers and the architect of its constitution, was influenced by the American philosopher John Dewey. Through meticulous archival research, Dr. Stroud uncovered the intellectual relationship between these two figures, revealing how pragmatist philosophy shaped Ambedkar's approach to addressing caste inequality in India. In our conversation, we explore Ambedkar's time as Dewey's student at Columbia University, how he adapted pragmatist ideas to the Indian context, and the broader connections between Eastern and Western philosophical traditions. Dr. Stroud shares fascinating discoveries from his research, including finding Ambedkar's classroom notes and personal annotations in his books. Join us for this illuminating discussion on philosophy, social justice, and the power of cross-cultural intellectual exchange.
Dr. Stroud, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Pranjal. I'm glad to be here, and I always love an opportunity to chat about Baba Sahib Ambedkar.
Absolutely. I read the book and it was extremely enlightening. We'll spend a big chunk of our conversation talking about that, how you discovered Baba Sahib, how you went about writing the book. But before the book, I'd love to know about the author a bit more, right? So every time I come across academics who've been working on India or Indian figures, I always ask them, what was the first time that they sort of interacted with India or its culture? Usually it's the first time they had Indian food, or if they made Indian friends when they were growing up. How was it in your case? When in your consciousness did you come across India as this entity with a culture, with a bunch of history and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I've known of India for a long time, but my, kind of sustained engagement with India and its culture began in, I think, 1999 or something, when I went to my first conference as a grad student. It was this argumentation conference up in the beautiful mountains of Utah, Alta Ski Lodge or something, but it was during the summer, so there weren't many people there. That's why they have the conference, but you were stuck up there, right? And so for some reason, I brought a copy of, I think it was the last name Aswaran, that was the translator, the Bhagavad Gita. And I took a copy of this Gita up there, and I was reading it, and I think at that point I had an idea that I wanted to do my master's thesis in communication on how narratives argue, how stories argue. And I had an inkling that this Bhagavad Gita didn't look like the other philosophical texts. I was an undergraduate philosophy major as well as communication. And so I took the Gita up there, and, I'd go hiking with folks. I'd sit there on the ski lodges, non-snowy chairs, and I'd stare at the mountains and I'd read the Gita. And I was really impressed by it. I mean, the kind of, that translation foregrounded the monist view of the Gita, or the monist interpretation. So I was attracted early on, starting with 1999. And then, I went and moved to the Bay Area while I did a master's at San Jose State in philosophy. And I kept going to the Ramakrishna Vedanta Society there in Berkeley on Sundays and listened to the Swamis talk. And so I was, constantly intrigued by this Vedantic philosophy, and, that came out in some measure in certain interpretations of the Gita. So, you can find, if you dig hard enough, a variety of publications of mine on the Gita. I've long taught the Gita. I've taught other Gitas. This was something that was, exciting for me. Finding out that the Vedantin tradition had these Gitas that looked kind of like the Bhagavad Gita, but, kind of argued in a different monistic way. And then, that is kind of, that engagement with the Gita has been minimized as I moved more and more towards Ambedkar after 2014. But, obviously, like Ambedkar, the Gita is an incredibly important text. Love it or hate it, you have to come to terms with it. And so, I'm glad I had that period where I got into Vedanta. I still teach all this stuff, but that was my first engagement way back in 99.
Now that's amazing. And a lot of people don't know that there's multiple Gitas. I think there's almost more than 20 Gitas. The Ashtavakra Gita is extremely famous. The regular Bhagavad Gita, of course, is very famous. When you were introduced to the Gita, I'm guessing you must have already had a bunch of experience within the Western philosophical traditions, the Greeks and the Kants of the world. How different was the monist view which you were introduced to with the Gita? Was there any parallel in the West of similar thinking, or was this very different and an entirely Eastern or Oriental school of thought?
It was, it was very different. I think that's probably what attracted me to the Gita, for better or worse, was this kind of foreignness to the argument's goals, and the way the argument proceeded. So like you get stories, narrative form in Plato, but, it doesn't seem as, as rich as what you see in the Gita tradition. For instance, I learned this later on, the Anu Gita is a retelling of the Bhagavad Gita, and it has that classic Indian, storytelling technique of answering a philosophical question by telling a story about someone else telling a story about someone having a dream in which they told someone a story. So that nested narrative nature. So the Gita goes some distance towards that, but the Anu Gita and other texts really run with the potentials of narrative. So that kind of was different from anything I'd seen in a philosophical class that I'd taken. And now, of course, you can find monism in the West. Plotinus takes this, Platonic view and runs with it in a monistic direction. But, every culture kind of has its unique way of doing things. And there was something very unique going on in Vedanta.
Right. And when you're now from being a student, now when you're a teacher and teaching all of these, do you find the students are students inherently more ready to understand the Western school of thoughts as opposed to the Eastern? Like what tradition do you have more difficulty in teaching to your class of philosophy students?
Ironically, maybe all of the traditions. So, I'm in a college of communication. I'm in a department of communication studies. So a lot of my majors, they're getting ready to go off into careers in PR or, running business communications. So I think in many ways, if I make them read Plato, or if I make them read the Sophists, or if I make them read the Gita or Shankara or Baba Sahib, all this stuff is new to them. And that's a challenge, but it's also awesome because, I always think like if I didn't talk about what Zen Buddhism is doing with koans, these folks might not kind of ever think about, the limitations of language and how to use language to get around those. So yeah, in many ways it's tough. Now, I've taught over in China, and then you could mention Confucius or Lao Tzu, and then they can understand Plato with that reference. India, it's probably things like the Gita are the parlance. But yeah, it's interesting. I can't even rely on them knowing a lot about Plato right off the bat.
Sure. That makes sense. And usually, and this is me thinking out loud, I'm always struck by how certain schools of philosophy or certain strands of philosophical thought suddenly become super famous in different times. So right now, Stoicism is having its day. Everyone is reading about Stoicism. Ryan Holiday is going about writing bestsellers. Do you have any thoughts on why that is? Like, why is it that Stoicism suddenly is like the de facto pop philosophy right now, as opposed to something like a Vedanta or as opposed to something else?
Yeah, and it's interesting too, right? Because you look at the Stoics like Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus, and they're not manuals on how to gain a lot of power or get a lot of riches. And so, yeah, it's interesting, especially the folks in the tech side of the internet that take up Stoicism. It's interesting just to me why they would pick Stoicism. But I think there's kind of this manliness aspect of Stoicism that goes with some of the, agonistic or aggressive tendencies in certain online communities. They want to do something. They want to have this self-assertion. And that Stoic kind of recipe does that. I mean, at the end of the day, you can bend philosophies however you want. And if you sell some books, that's all good. Marcus Aurelius, though, the Stoics are just always fascinating because, I mean, technically, Marcus Aurelius didn't really want his thoughts to get out there. I mean, they were unpublished for 1,500 years. And when they were published, people were worried about what kind of document was this? Was it a book or was it a diary? I think diary was the genre his meditations fit into, but it's a weird diary. It doesn't really recount, what meals he had, what day. I mean, it was a better way to look at it is, going back to my tradition of rhetoric, it was a series of rhetorical exercises that he was putting himself through to get rid of this kind of overweening focus on the self and what I mean. Every once in a while, I think of one line from the meditations, soon you will forget about the world and the world will forget about you. And this is kind of puts it into, the next article we're fighting to get published or something against reviewers. In the big scheme of things, everything's going to be washed away, and the Stoics got that. So it's fascinating that a lot of people that are trying to change the world, like through
Right.
tech, might grab onto that. But, I haven't studied their texts. I got enough to read, so I can't criticize it. Good for them if they want to pick up Stoicism as a useful philosophy.
Absolutely. And I think this core idea of a inherent sense of detachment is also so fundamental to Buddhism, and very much so in popular traditions. I think Buddhist literature has had a much larger sway than the Upanishads or the Vedanta, right from Hermann Hesse to, more popular cultures of more popular books writing about Buddhist thoughts and things like that.
Yeah, I teach a class, usually once a year to upper division undergraduates here at UT Austin called Rhetoric East and West. It could also be called global rhetoric. But the idea is, how do different cultures argue their, very important philosophical points, usually about morality? Like, why does Jesus use parables to try to push people towards, becoming better folks? Why does Confucius, use this kind of fragmented way of discussing Ren and cultivation when he's trying to, convince his disciples or anyone listening to be a morally cultivated person? So at any rate, the Stoics always figure in that. And one thing I've noticed about all these traditions, I teach an ethics class where we go through Kant and utilitarianism, Jain ethics a little bit, but all of these traditions, one of the major targets is desire, and the focus on self it inevitably brings. But no one emphasizes it as much or in a very unique and useful way as, like you say, Buddhists or, the Gita, some of the, and Stoics maybe are close, but, some of these traditions really do a excellent job of, kind of focusing all their energy on desire and self-focus. I don't think there aren't many of these moral theories that say, yeah, feed those desires and just do you. So most of them are trying to get us, away from that. Think about the desires of others, for instance,
Right.
Not just our happiness, but yeah.
I think the hedonists and the epicurists would probably be in the latter camp, and they're saying just indulge your desires, although they do a really smart thing of just defining what desires are supposed to be, where it's not as if you're going all out. But yeah, I think I'd completely agree.
Yeah, there's an interesting thinker in the wake of Confucius, Xunzi. And, he and Mencius are often taken as kind of opposite ways to interpret Confucius. And, Confucius kind of left the idea of are humans inherently good ambiguous. He wanted to build up the right kind of person. Mencius, staked his claim saying humans are inherently good. Xunzi is often taken as saying humans are inherently evil. But, if you look closer at what Xunzi is saying, it's something, not foreign to what Kant or Plato was saying, which is, if you let the human desires go without regulation, they're going to get you into trouble. They're going to make you do things that we probably class as evil. So it's not that we just are inherently bad and seek out maximizing that bad. It's just that these desires will lead us down, paths that just won't work for us, won't work for others. This is the nature of kind of evil in Xunzi's view. So it's fascinating to see these kind of themes that are there in so many world philosophies, but they get emphasized and said and contextualized in different ways.
This reminds me of the Hobbes and Rousseau sort of a difference, that nasty brute is short versus man is born free and he's in chains everywhere else. But Dr. Stroud, so you've been as a student, you have this brush with sort of both traditions of philosophy. When do you start discovering someone like John Dewey, which is also who plays a big role in the book Evolution of Pragmatism in India? What was your first brush with Dewey?
Yeah, so, after I did my master's at San Jose State University in philosophy. I wrote that master's thesis on Kant. And, I've had a long-standing fascination with Kant as well. But at any rate, I applied to a couple schools. One of the schools I, was accepted to was University of Hawaii Manoa, which has a wonderful comparative philosophy program, and I probably would have done more work on the Gita and Indian philosophy there. And then Temple, I was accepted to Temple in Philadelphia. And they have a very well-renowned program in philosophy of art. And they also have comparative folks. They had Jatindra Mohanty, who was a very well-known figure in Nyaya logic. And he also studied Husserl, someone who I find not that exciting in philosophy, but a very important philosophical figure. So at any rate, I had this choice to make. And, for various kind of, personal reasons, my wife and I went to Philadelphia. She also was in a program there. So at any rate, and I kind of like that art aspect, because a lot of the stuff that's talked about in aesthetics, philosophy of art, is really what I was wrestling with in rhetoric. Like how narratives argue, there are very close equivalents to that question in philosophy of art. What do we learn from fictional stories like Moby Dick? That's kind of how aestheticians will ask that question, and rhetoric folks will say, well, how's this popular movie arguing to these crowds? The Matrix, why was it so important? So, to certain crowds back then. So this is kind of, that got me there. And then when I showed up there, I need a mentor. And so my mentor at San Jose State, he knew this scholar there, Richard Schusterman. And so he said, go work with Schusterman. He does pragmatism. And up to that, I never read any of John Dewey. I read a little William James. James is the best writer anyone will ever read in philosophy classes. But, I talked to Schusterman the summer before I started. And I started to read Dewey, and I saw in John Dewey this kind of enlightening philosophy that didn't so much solve a lot of problems that philosophers posed, but he dissolved them. Like the idea is that, if you say, is the world an illusion or is there just reality? That distinction between reality and illusion is making you engage this world that we all engage in different ways in a kind of problematic way. So why don't you just stop thinking that way? So I really saw that, Dewey's pragmatism respected art, the stuff I've been studying in rhetoric, but popular art, things like movies are valuable on Dewey's account. And so, Dewey's philosophy became this powerful thing to study that kind of opened up aspects of art and morality. And my first book, which, eventually got published, I think 2011 or 12, was called John Dewey and the Artful Life. But it's an extended, revised version of my dissertation that I did at Temple with Schusterman. But, the idea was, what if we take Dewey's theory of art seriously, how can we relate art to morality or moral cultivation?
Okay. So as a layperson, so for example, when I look at something like pragmatism and I come across terms that you've used, things like reconstruction, things like habit, a lot of those sound awfully obvious to the non-philosopher. But when you were reading pragmatism, what do you think? What was the problem that pragmatism was really trying to solve as a philosophy? And was that was John Dewey the father of pragmatism, or was the philosophy always there and just Dewey was the best articulator of the philosophy?
Yeah. A lot of people say pragmatism is a distinctively American philosophy. And in some ways that's true. That highlights certain aspects of it, because pragmatism as it is formed with a small reading group in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? In Boston. And this had William James famously, Chauncey Wright, if I remember right, and Charles Saunders Peirce, who becomes a big figure. So it had some of these key figures right at the beginning. And, they jokingly named their club, their reading group, the Metaphysical Club. And Louis Menand and others have done a lot of great work, explaining, yeah. So, I mean, so at any rate, but what were they joking about? What were they why did they need a group to talk about stuff that wasn't metaphysics? Well, what was happening, right, was a civil war that, had just concluded, and this shook every aspect of American society. Darwin had just dropped his Origin of Species, and this had shook, so much in kind of the intellectual landscape. And so these thinkers, these were not, your normal thinkers that were dedicated to philosophy as basically a theological pursuit. And that's kind of what philosophy was back then. You had a lot of neo-Hegelians and such. And so there's this exciting moment in America where America, was trying to figure out what to do with its universities, and its thinkers were trying to figure out what to do. You had folks in Europe moving towards empirical or more empirical ways of doing psychology. You had this Hegelian wave that was cresting over both continents, and these thinkers didn't like that Hegelian approach. And so you start getting these thinkers writing down their own kind of rebellions against this tradition. And so William James and Peirce are the ones that we really remember as kind of that first wave. Dewey, he studied, Peirce was a teacher of his for one semester. Dewey was not particularly taken by Peirce, but eventually Dewey and James have long correspondences about their each of their psychology books. They both published fairly well-known psychology books in the 1890s. Dewey's has since been forgotten because it was in his kind of neo-Hegelian phase. And James is, of course, is still kind of very famous as one of the most influential historical books in American psychology. And so at any rate, you get, and that's one thing that's exciting to me about it. In some ways, James and Peirce were the old dogs of this tradition. In other ways, James is reading Dewey's psychology and saying, this is awesome. And Dewey is reading James's psychology. So there's this kind of contemporariness of it. They're all doing this at the same time. It's not one's here and then teaches the next and then dies. So that story, it's uniquely something about America and the geography, that there's a usefulness to that. Other scholars will say, well, it continues themes that were being bandied about in European philosophy, the reaction to Hegel and such, which, there's a point to that. The key thing is the stories we tell about philosophical traditions are always a shortening of the vast reality. Probably we have to shorten. We can't just have every detail. So, this is the key thing is, well, the stories we tell about American pragmatism, are they useful in drawing our attention to, let's say, figures or approaches that we might have missed? And so I love that tradition, and I was immediately enamored by it at Temple because it, in Dewey's words, rejected the quest for certainty that so many other philosophers, including my beloved Kant, wanted. Because they wanted philosophies that mirrored the world, that captured what was happening in the world. And the pragmatist said, in the age of science and Darwin, the world is not set to allow that. And we are not endowed to just simply come up with theories that are capturing the mind of God. We're creatures with purposes, and we engage the world with those purposes.
There's so I'm curious, were people like John Dewey and all the other members of the Metaphysical Club, were they intimately familiar with any of the Eastern traditions? Because the sort of inherent comfort with doubt is something which comes very naturally to the readers of the Gita, to the readers of the Vedas, to the readers of the Upanishads. So did they know? In the book, you do mention that Dewey never visited India. He was supposed to, but that trip never happened. But what were their readings like? Were they intimately aware with everything that had happened in the world of philosophy, which is non-Western? Or was their reading pretty much limited to the European schools and the American schools?
Well, so let's take two of them. I leave Peirce aside because Peirce, when he died, he had 40,000 unpublished pages or something jammed in his office. And so it takes a lifetime to understand or even access what Peirce was about. But take William James, his work on religion is just awesome because it has this charitable spirit, to all these traditions. And one of those traditions he engages and is charitable to and, kind of sees value in is, the Vedantic tradition of Hinduism. Now, there's a story here, and, I've gotten into it a little bit. Others are slowly filling it out. But what happened in 1893, right, is the West got introduced to Swami Vivekananda at the World's Parliament of Religion. And, Vivekananda started as a no-name at that conference. I always tell my grad students about this because, Vivekananda showed up to a conference around the world, showed up to it without an invitation or a paper accepted. It's kind of the naivete of that. And he eventually meets the right people and gets on that stage as a no-name. And 17 days later, they're using his picture on bus stands to sell tea. He's that famous. And so he was a rock star in like 2 weeks. And then he goes on a lecture tour. So he's always fascinated me as one of these figures that, against all odds, an America that was not ready for Vedanta, an America that was hostile to Hinduism, he's able to kind of sell it to all these Christians and get them excited about it. And so, James, knew of Vivekananda. He actually met Vivekananda at one point in a Harvard colloquium. And James, we have these letters from James where he says, hey, I tried Raja Yoga, one of the books and the practices promoted by the Swami. But, he said, it's just not for me. I'm too much of a thinking person. So it sounds like James tried it in a typical Jamesian fashion. He tried it a little bit, then he moved on to something else. And, someone else, I need to flesh out this story more, but someone that was a little more influential was a fellow monk of Vivekananda's, Swami Ambedkar. Ambedkar spent a bit more time in Boston, actually sat in the class, a few classes with James, and when James was talking about monism, apparently one of the students, James's students, asked him about monism, and he said, well, we have an expert right here. And he points to Ambedkar, and asked Ambedkar to say a few things. And so, I've not found any records of what Ambedkar said, but anyway, there's this fascinating kind of engagement, even personal engagement between James and, Advaita Vedanta largely. And, so James knew about this stuff, whether or not it's the bulk of his philosophy, that's, a different question. I think he's wrestling with stuff that's easier to get, that was another tough thing is a lot of these translations were just happening by German Orientalists. and it was tough to get to them. And so, for instance, I wrote a article for The Pluralist. This is a pragmatist journal that's read by just boring academics. But my number one question everyone asks me when I talk on Ambedkar and Dewey in India is, but what did Dewey learn from Ambedkar, or what did Dewey know of India, as a larger question? And so that article, I spend 12,000 words or whatever, but I try to do the most comprehensive examination of Dewey in India as possible. And there's a variety of findings. Well, first of all, Dewey should have taken advantage of having a student like Ambedkar. We'll talk about Ambedkar in a minute. But anyway, Dewey didn't seem... Here's what this thing with Dewey, right? In the 1890s, some of these translations of Vedanta were starting. I think Mueller was one of the translators. They were, and Deussen, they were just making, print. And Dewey reviews a few of them in the 1890s. And, from those references to these Indian texts, you can kind of see his attitude. And he was largely dismissive. I mean, he's like, these are good translations. It's an interesting tradition, but you could get all of this in Spinoza in the West.
Okay.
Yeah, so, so Dewey was kind of clinging on to that latter Western philosophy. And then what happens, in the 1910s, he stumbles. I call him the Mr. Magoo of philosophy. He stumbles off a cliff and gets invited to China because he had all these Chinese students and Japanese students, and they learned he was in California. So they get him to Japan and they get him to China. And when he's in China, and shortly before he went to China, one of his good friends, Albert Barnes, the art collector, said, there's more good art in the temples in India than all of China and Japan combined. You got to go to India. And so you get these letters back and forth where Dewey's like, yeah, I'll go to Tibet, I'll go to Kashmir, so Dewey's all excited. And then about when his China trip turns from 3 months into 6 months to 9 months, you get these letters back to his family where he's like, I don't want to lose track of my country and what's happening politically. I'll go to India another time. Or maybe the espionage with the Brits and cramping down on the independence movement, it's going to be too tough to go to India. So Dewey gives all these excuses and he never goes to India, and that's a shame. Because if he would have saw, let's say caste and religion on the streets of Mumbai, a common faith, a text he wrote on religion, dismissing traditional views of religion for something he thought was valuable, that would have been different than what it was in 1934. So, but anyway, he was close to going to India. He didn't. But what happens is later in his life, you start to see him review or write like introductions. There was a book, I believe the last name was by Chatterjee, called The Vedic Way of Life or something like this. But it was kind of an intro to, Hinduism's Vedic tradition. But, Dewey writes an intro to it, and it's short, but it's very positive. It's just like, I'm the wrong person to write an intro to this, but this is so exciting. So by 1930, Dewey's starting to open up to it. And in the 1940s, philosophy's opening up to Eastern thought, and you get the movements based in Hawaii largely for the East-West Philosophers Conference and that very still famous journal Philosophy East and West. And Dewey wrote the first article in the first issue of Philosophy East and West for Charles Moore, and it was called Synthetic Philosophy. So and then he dies like a year later. So that's the sad arc of Dewey's life. He starts off dismissive of India. He had a student from India we'll talk about, but he didn't really take advantage of that from what I can tell. Then, he starts opening up to world philosophy as being a way to make creative links and newness that we need in our philosophy. And then by the end of his life, he's talking about synthetic global philosophy. But, he dies and he runs out of energy just in time to, capitalize on that.
That's one of those classic what if moments in history, right? That is, what if Dewey had not been dismissive? What if he had actually taken Ambedkar's invite and actually come down to India and things like that? But when you mentioned Vivekananda, that's very interesting, because when I used to live in Chicago, I used to live right down the road from the Art Institute. That's where Swami Vivekananda gave the classic Brothers and Sisters of America speech. And that comment on the art pieces in temple in the Temple of India, that sounds so eerily similar, although in the opposite sense, from another thing which was said about Indian literature in 1835 by Thomas Macaulay. And therein the line was that one shelf of good English literature is worth more than all the libraries of Arabia and India. So that it's good to see that there were differing views even in the 1800s. But So let's get to the student of John Dewey that we've been talking about. Usually, when people start talking about like the famous historically famous Indians, they either start with Gandhi. Sometimes it could be the Buddha. Sometimes it's Nehru. Ambedkar still doesn't prefigure as strongly in that list. So amongst all of these, founding fathers of India. Was Ambedkar the first person you engaged with academically, or even before that, had you been working with Gandhi or Nehru or anyone else?
No, yeah. So again, I was focused on old stuff. This is kind of a philosophical bias. The older stuff is the serious stuff, maybe. So, I was focused on the Gita. I was looking at all those Avadhuta Gita, Devi Gita, Ashtavakra Gita, the Vedantic texts we have. Shankara's works are fascinating. So I kind of, those are my touchstones. And I, of course, knew of Gandhi. I didn't really get into Gandhi because Gandhi, anyone that wants to start reading Gandhi, there's 99 volumes that confront you where to start. So at any rate,
Right.
I respected Gandhi. I knew other people who respected him too. And so, but I didn't get into that. And what happened was in 2004, again, think about Dewey, what we said a second ago. Some of this stuff is just kind of, the ball breaks the wrong way when you hit the billiard ball, or, the butterfly flaps the wings differently. Right. A lot of the stuff that has consequential, kind of impacts is not intentional, or it's, fortune or bad luck or good luck. And so, in 2004, when I was in the midst of Temple's philosophy program and I was writing a dissertation on John Dewey and art, I had a organization I had started a few years before called the Society for Student Philosophers. And, it held conferences at different universities where I could kind of eke out the money to run this. But the idea was to get students involved in the stuff they're going to be involved in after they get their graduate degree. So I was lucky there. We held it at Grand Valley State University, and they had given us, nice support. And I was able to, arrange for Martha Nussbaum to come over from Chicago to give a keynote at this Grand Valley State, in Grand Rapids, Michigan conference. And so, when I was walking, Nussbaum from her car to the lunch we arranged in her honor, and, for the participants, you always got to feed students. So, I was talking with her, and she knew that I was working with Schusterman on Dewey, and so she mentioned, just small talk, do you know of an Indian student of Dewey's named Ambedkar? And I like to say I was a grad student. I wish I had half the energy I had back then now. So grad students have all this energy, but they don't have the track record, perhaps. They haven't read as many books or ignored as many books as they will later. So at any rate, I kind of brushed that aside. I said, oh, no, I don't know, but you could probably search for it in Past Masters, the database of Dewey's works. And so, I kind of brushed it aside. But like now that I look back with the fullness of time, if I wouldn't have walked her from her car to the venue and she hadn't brought up that topic of small talk about Dewey related things, I wouldn't be who I am today, and I wouldn't have the kind of passions and projects I have right now. So what happened was 10 years after that was 2004, 2014, I'm on sabbatical, and my wife is on sabbatical, and we're over in Princeton, and we're trying to, research our next projects. I was supposed to be writing a book. I still have it in me on Dewey and rhetorical criticism. Sure. The arts of how people argue, but from a pragmatist view. And, I kind of, as we all do, I kind of started doing other things. And, I Googled Ambedkar, I probably Googled something like Indian student Dewey, and I found the Wikipedia page or whatever on Ambedkar. And then I Googled his name, and I found, I'm positive, it's the first thing I found was Columbia's version of Annihilation of Caste. It always comes up in the hits. So I started reading it, and in Annihilation of Caste, he mentions Dewey by name twice. But in the other parts that weren't talking about Dewey, I started to see stuff that I'm like, I squint at it, I'm like, that sounds just like Dewey. And so and then as I dug deeper, I kind of unearthed this kind of interesting relationship where Ambedkar would repurpose some parts of Dewey's philosophy in this Indian context that Dewey didn't know about or didn't really care much about. So it's this fascinating, kind of intercultural moment, like Vivekananda coming to the West and bending us to his view. In some ways, Ambedkar is this opposite kind of hybrid. He takes the best of Dewey and figures at the London School of Economics and goes back to India and does things in those contexts with some of those resources. So 2014, I I just start my fascination with Ambedkar. And interestingly enough, the summer of 2014, right before I, started Googling all this Ambedkar stuff, I, visited India twice, studying with the Jains. I stayed at Jain temples. The International Summer School for Jain Studies is still going program, and it's awesome. It's a great way for Americans to, experience India, especially Jainism. They'd take you to Jain temples and have Jain lectures. So at any rate, I was just fresh off of seeing India with those guides and those frames. And then after that spring, let's say, of 2015, every trip that I've taken to India, I've taken quite a few, I'm always there visiting my friends in the Ambedkarite movement. That's my new frame and new entry to India. So anyway, this is a little bit about my history and how it informs how I stumbled into Ambedkar.
Right. Now, I love the part about where you mentioned in the book that Ambedkar was quoting Dewey in a way that only people who would have known Dewey would have understood that there's something here. And then how you mentioned how the two systems of quotations are inherently different. The quotation in the West versus the quotation system in the East, where it's a little more nested in that sense. But when Ambedkar comes to India and he's talking about John Dewey, you also mentioned in the book that Dewey is very famous in America, but not a lot of people know him in India. So in that context of India, in that contemporary India, who were the philosophers, the Western philosophers, who were sort of ruling the ideological mainstream of sorts? Like I know Harold Lasky could be one, because Nehru loved Harold Lasky and all of that. But who were the other? Were there any American philosophers who the general Indian intelligentsia knew about?
That's an interesting question. Not many. Now, interestingly enough, I love Ambedkar because trying to figure out his philosophical value and figuring out its connection to something I like, pragmatism, you go down all these side paths. And of course, one of those side paths was in 1948, as you know, Ambedkar republished P.K. Narasu's The Essence of Buddhism, right? And so, part of what I was doing when I engaged that, his view on Buddhism, I still have a lot to write on that. But, I looked at the different editions of Narasu's Buddhism, and you go back to 1907 and you look at the earliest edition of it, but all those editions have, some passages in it. Narasu cites William James a lot, like overtly cites the varieties of religious experience. Again, because of what I said a second ago, James in the varieties was very friendly to especially, Vedantic monism. He didn't dismiss it. He didn't ignore it. He presented it. And, and he used it. And so Narasu keeps citing James as an authority on religion. And so that's fascinating. But then I came across a passage in Narasu where it's in all the editions, including 1907, and it's on there are 4 ways to fix your beliefs, to settle your beliefs, decide which belief is the one to hold. And he goes through them all: authority, force, science is the ultimate one. But at any rate, if you've read some Peirce, you recognize those as the key things from Peirce's very important early article, how to, the fixation of belief, where he gives at the end of it these 4 same ones. So at any rate, there in Narasu, if you know Peirce, you see how Narasu is reading Peirce. So, and again, that's 1907 or whenever that first edition came out. So some of these ideas from America are there, but I think everything published in, the empire made its way there first. So figures like Bertrand Russell were, much more accessible. Literally you could buy their books easier than you could, Dewey's at Connaught Place. So I think that's why in 1918, one of Ambedkar's first publications, his second, I think, it's a book review of Bertrand Russell, because this is someone that, some intelligentsia in India will know of, and it's someone that Dewey had some major philosophical disputes with. So it's only natural that, Ambedkar would cut his teeth on that.
Right. So, and I think Bertrand Russell was definitely, I'd say, was more famous as compared to John Dewey in the Indian circles. We have Nehru quoting Bertrand Russell almost verbatim in Glimpses of World History. But talking about Ambedkar, particularly in terms of what was he doing after having taken some of pragmatist thoughts and then employing them in a very Indian context, what do you think was truly original about Ambedkar's philosophy? Like, where do you think, this person comes in and really breaks away from whatever is happening in that Indian zeitgeist and contributes something original to both the social context and the Indian philosophy is happening there?
Yeah, I think one of the most original things or original characteristics of Ambedkar's philosophy is this kind of, postulation of this middle ground of ideals. So this is like a classic philosophical conundrum. Even the pragmatists try to get out of it, but they kind of fall to one side of a dichotomy. And, so like, where do our ideals come from? That guide us, that help us say, this is not the right way to treat people. This is not the right way to, make a society work. Well, one view is you point to some other realm that promises certainty and authority, a touchstone. These ideals come from God. They come from, they're heard from time immemorial in the Vedas, let's say. They come from pure reason in terms of Kant, or they're, they're self-illuminating in terms of Descartes. They don't have internal contradictions such that you see this thing has to be the case. So at any rate, that's kind of one of the standard East-West philosophical moves. You point to something that won't change, and that gives you the authority to kind of, apply that and not have many questions arise. And so the other extreme is, maybe, what you just call relativism, where you're like, well, it just always depends. And you can't get out of context, and that's what it depends on. And that's, eternally unsatisfying, because, we want to tell people, short of using violence, here's how you should be arranging life. So Ambedkar enters the kind of, his life enters this long tradition in India where people are classified based upon birth and their parents. And, that classification has a normative aspect to it. Some cat, so you look down with kind of disgust, he says, right? And you look up with reverence.
Yes.
And
yeah.
So, the caste system, of course, is incredibly complex. Of course, it evolves over time. But, Ambedkar's latching on to something in his lived experience and in the experience of so many others, which is that there's this kind of graded hierarchy. And it's hard to get away from. You pass a law, ends up doing that later in his life, but you can't get away from it, because it's a mindset. So how do we go about telling people that kind of historical setting is problematic, without pointing to something just as, kind of fake in Ambedkar's view as what caused that tradition? Ambedkar thought this was just a creation of people saying, this is the mind of God and this is the way it has to be. But it doesn't have to be that way, Ambedkar said. And, he's obviously proposing an egalitarian alternative. So what, what I think is the most unique thing about him is his constant insistence on this kind of middle ground between saying our ideals come from a very specific context and our ideals come from something eternal. Dewey erred on the side of that context. The best you can find in Dewey, is he says, the moral end that guides us is, the best we can say, is growth. Always keep growing as a society. So, Dewey will talk about intelligent habits, but the point is there's not just one way habits can be intelligent. And when we're all plugged into Mind Book 20 years down the road, there's going to be new ways for our habits to be intelligent. So Dewey's philosophy prized the kind of flux of the world and tried to extract these values from that flux. And I think Ambedkar, he was never satisfied with that, because that would mean look in the Dharmic tradition and find your way to critique caste there. And of course, some people do. They'll try to say, caste is not in the Vedas and such. But, Gandhi kind of took this technique. But for someone like Ambedkar, Varna and caste, differences in complexity, but they all said the same thing. There was an essence to people, and that essence correlated to some aspect of their value or potential value. And so he constantly tried to find that middle ground. And of course, he fell in love with those three values: liberty, equality, fraternity. And what's fascinating is Dewey didn't care much about those values. He didn't make a big deal of them. And Ambedkar wasn't wedded to the French Revolution. He's not reading many French philosophers. So what's fascinating about Ambedkar is he gives this new kind of sense of pragmatism, where look, our ideals, we kind of construct those and claim those, and let's see how life turns out on those, following those out. So he was very consistent, is, kind of always saying things would be better if we can strike a balance between the equality of everyone, the ability of each person to pursue their actions in liberty, and this kind of, seek this fellow love, fraternity, that, that he so those things he always kind of emphasized. And it was a problematic mix, right? I mean, fellow love sometimes goes against equality or liberty. And liberty definitely will tend to, if you're good at what you're doing, you might be unequal pretty soon to others. And so Ambedkar recognized the tension that was generated by those values, but he kind of loved that middle ground. And look at what he's doing. He's taking something from France and he puts them in the Indian Constitution. And, that shows his pragmatism. They're not French things, he says. I can own them too. And they're not dharmic, but they can apply to this country, this area that's been under dharmic sway for thousands of years. So this is Ambedkar's mindset, and I just found it refreshingly new.
No, absolutely. And particularly for Ambedkar, so the first time you're getting introduced to Ambedkar, he's, of course, a multifaceted man, right? He's a lawyer, he's a theologian at times, he's a philosopher. Today, he's almost a semi-divine figure in certain circles. So how do you look at Ambedkar? Do you look at him primarily as a philosopher who was also dabbling in the real world through politics? Or do you look at him primarily as a politician who also gets trained in philosophies and then does something else?
Yeah, and that's a tough question. I'm biased. I like thinkers and philosophers. What that kind of means is people who don't do stuff, right? And that's one reason why Western academia has ignored Ambedkar largely, and it's starting to change. But, like Jane Addams decades ago, Ambedkar was coded as a doer, an activist, like you said, a politician, a civil rights leader. So, people kind of said, let's let sociology or whatever deal with that. And so philosophy, I've still had pushback on this. So like I wrote the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and I told them, y'all have all these entries of Gandhi in there. You have a Buddhism and AI entry. Why don't you have something on Ambedkar? He matters to a lot of people, and he was, he's a PhD. He wrote books that look philosophical. So, there's no reason. They said, there's not enough people talking in the West about him. Check back in 5 years. And, and I was just taken aback by that, because imagine right when philosophy started figuring out that not just white people can do philosophy. Right. Imagine someone saying, hey, we need to bring Fanon into this anthology. Imagine someone saying, well, not a lot of people read him, so let's wait, check back 5 years. The problem is not a lot of people read him. Let's change it by including him. So anyway, this is some of the tensions I face in the West. He's not a known quantity as a theorist, let's say, if he's even known as an activist. And you got to tell people this. And that's been one thing that I think has been useful of my own passion project, which is connecting Ambedkar and Dewey and telling the story of Ambedkar and Dewey, which is that pragmatism and Dewey has known cachet in philosophy and, kind of theoretical circles in the West. So Ambedkar, by making him part of that story, you can get him in front of these people. Now, I readily acknowledge a lot of people can do different stories about Ambedkar, but the thing I just sensed was if you just tell the same story, Ambedkar, grew up a Dalit, he was oppressed. Annihilation of caste is for the annihilation of caste. His Buddhist views in the 1950s were about emancipation from caste. You just tell that same story, you never get that entry to these other people that are looking for, kind of a different angle on something. So that's kind of the tension I feel. Some people want to tell the same stories about Ambedkar, and I think you're losing some opportunities. Ambedkar belongs, Annihilation of Caste belongs in our intro to philosophy classes. I make my students in this comparative rhetoric class read parts from Annihilation and parts from Buddha and his Dhamma. For making them read Shankara, why not read Ambedkar? That's my thinking.
And I think that is, you've been doing a commendable job in changing that more people in the West read about Ambedkar, and amen to that in the next 5 years, hopefully we'll have an entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia for philosophy. But particularly now, coming back to Ambedkar, you talked about how you wanted to tell the story between Ambedkar and Dewey and all of that. Let's talk about the mechanics of the storytelling a bit as well. Now, this book clearly quotes a lot of passages from Dewey. Now, those are traditionally philosophical texts. So you'll have things which a normal, like a lay person who's not read philosophy might find it a bit difficult, which I did as well. So thanks to GPT, I had my resources and I could sort of then eventually go along with the book. But when you were writing this book, what were the sort of muscles that you were exercising? Were you conscious of the fact that, all right, this might be only for a specific niche audience? and I should probably try and generalize it for the regular people? Like, what was your thought process when you were writing this book?
Yeah, it was largely going to be a book for like pragmatists, let's say, people in American philosophy, to understand this relationship. But the book is fascinating, and like so many things, that we just read on paper, there's like a history behind it. And what happened with the book, right, was that it was originally under contract with Chicago, and then the HarperCollins thing happened later. And the HarperCollins edition is the South Asian edition, and that was widely available in South Asia. I mean, I've seen it at airport book-stalls on my way back from Mumbai. Yes. So every once in a while, I feel sorry for someone who just grabs it at a train station and wants to have a light read on the train. It's a very intense book. It's a scholarly book, But the challenge is, what I had noticed back in 2014 when I started Googling Ambedkar, and I started sensing that there's a story here. I started looking, at Zeliot and, Umvelt and Keir. I started looking at all the classical sources on Ambedkar, the people that are that really brought Ambedkar to the West early on, before me and anyone else. And so, I started looking at all the Christopher Queen, who's since become one of my great friends. I started reading his work because he mentions Dewey. But no one went into detail on the Dewey and Ambedkar connection, and that's what I think really pushed me forward. Was everyone had a paragraph, or Zeliot had Eleanor Zeliot and her wonderful work. She had something that kind of speculated on, well, America was kind of progressive, so that probably made Ambedkar progressive. But there's never like any detail given in that. So one of the things that's maybe cumbersome about my book, one of the things that's incredibly unique about my book, is that I get into that classroom. And so everyone says Ambedkar, I'm constantly kind of scandalized by this. Everyone says Ambedkar had this great education, 50 classes at Columbia. We have his transcript of all of them, London School of Economics, all these people that he learned from over there. But no one gives you any details about what he heard from these people. The best is maybe someone will say Lasky published this book during the years that Ambedkar was, listening to lectures or talking with Lasky. But there's no guarantee that book was what Lasky was telling him about. And some philosophers have kind of given up on this, or some thinkers. They say, we just can't get into that. I always say, if only Ambedkar had a TikTok, you could kind of see what he was doing every day, or a diary or something. But we just don't have that. So a lot of people, I think, throw their hands up. And one of the things I kind of stumbled upon early on was that Dewey's works and Dewey's history and his interaction with his students was very well preserved. There's a great Dewey Center at Southern Illinois Carbondale. And, so I went there, and I knew from that Columbia transcript what courses Ambedkar took. Yes. And, so this wonderful Dewey Center has all these old decaying notes from Dewey on these classes, many of them dated, and from his students, many of them dated. So I eventually found a handful of student notes from those classes, and lo and behold, a couple of the days when the students, the American students couldn't, take notes, they had substitute note takers. And one of those days is notes by Ambedkar. So that's been there in those notes for, since those lecture notes were from 1915. They've been there for 100 years, and just the right person asking the right questions never ended up in front of them. The people that hold them didn't know about Ambedkar. The scholars visiting them didn't care about Ambedkar. So just, so when I saw that, I'm like, man, this gives us a day-by-day account of what Ambedkar heard from his teacher. And then you can start saying what's in his work that seems to be extending that or rejecting it. And so this is kind of the line of questioning my book, follows through. So again, it's very intense. This is the first time I've done archival work. I have great respect for people that have to dig through dusty archives to get into the mind of someone. But it's been intensely rewarding, and I think it's so much better than if I would have just sat down like some of the earlier books did, which have a value, and just say, hey, here's some themes of Dewey's philosophy, and here's some themes of Ambedkar's. And you can see how they're related. There's a usefulness to that, but we got to go beyond that. And that historical story is part of going beyond that.
Yeah. The first time I think I was at the UT library, and that's where I just had a bunch of bookmarks. And one of them said the evolution of pragmatism in India. At first, I thought, this is probably an academic book. And then I saw Ambedkar's photo on that. I'm like, wait a minute, I need to pick this up now. And then I saw your name, and then I researched the book. And then I was widely fascinated because While in India, Ambedkar is extremely famous and tomes have been written about him. But this aspect of his years as a student and what is it that he was learning was something which clearly not a lot of light had been thrown on there. So, and now when you describe the way you went about the archives and discovered those notes by Ambedkar, that's almost like an Indiana Jones sort of a feeling that you were hunting for gold and you just suddenly struck gold in one of the archives. But I'm curious, like, did you also get to do like archival work in India? What was the difference in the, like, I've heard horror stories about people trying to get to specific tomes within archival libraries in India. Like, how different is archival work, archival research in America and India?
Yeah, India is, as the Jains first told me, high entropy. There's a lot of, So I mean, it's chaotic, but you just gotta. What I love is you have to be able to just learn how to go with that flow and be flexible. In America, if you're going to an archive, you dial up the boxes, probably what the contents are, and you go there, and you have to wash your hands, put gloves on, and they take away your pens and such. And so India, many of the archives there have different standards. Some of the archives, I wish they would do a little bit more to preserve the books and stuff. Sure. But the lucky thing is when I'm going to India and visiting my friends and seeing the sites, like one of my friends, Vijay Sarwade, he's awesome. He knows so much about Ambedkar, and he's such a nice guy. And I just love talking to him. He lives outside of Mumbai. But, he'll take me to Siddharth College or take me to certain archives, and we'll look at some of these books. And, it's just fascinating to just go through them. Siddharth College I love because it's, these are the halls that Ambedkar founded. And, very much in the line of what Dewey was up to, right? Which is like, if we're going to have our philosophy matter, it should matter in schools. And so Baba Sahib, in many ways, started schools and hostels, like Dewey or Jane Addams would have recognized. And so, you go through Siddharth College and you look at these books. And what I found early on, thanks to, an American friend, Chris Queen, Ambedkar had all these books, 50,000 when he died, right? About 20,000 were in Delhi and 30,000 were at Rajgraha in Mumbai. And so when he died, those books got, most of them got sent to his colleges. I've actually found, books that have Ambedkar's distinctive underlining in the student stacks at Siddharth College. They were mixed in there. Yeah. So, I mean, and you see the purpose back when he died, before he died, actually, because some of these books, one I found checked out from Siddharth College, it had a checkout card, and it had Ambedkar 1953 to 1955. So he's checking out his own books that he donated to Siddharth College. So at any rate, when I found that one, I gave it to the archival folks, the librarians, and said, hey, this is a special one. Let's stop checking it out to students and put it in the special stuff. So at any rate, it's always an adventure. And, one time I was looking through some of these books and, a book by Dewey, I think it was called The Influence of Darwin on Philosophy. And inside the cover, one thing you learn about people like Ambedkar, when he's a student, he's not as busy. When he's writing the Constitution, basically, he's very busy. So if you look at his books, early on, he had the time and the energy to date them. He'd write B.R. Ambedkar, Columbia University, 1914, October. So, by the end of his life, he has a stamp, B.R. Ambedkar, that he just puts in there. So at any rate, he's very busy. But, when he was young, he loved these books, and those were his treasured possessions at Columbia. Was he'd scour the bookshops when he wasn't in the library. And he amassed this huge collection of books. And I have a similar problem. I love having the books. He would have hated our PDF infatuation now. But anyway, I found this book and I looked at it a few times. The archivist always gave it to me and I looked through it. But it was, this book from Dewey, and it's dated October 1914. And that was the first semester when he took a Dewey class at Columbia. And about the third time I looked at it, my third little pilgrimage there with my pals to just look at these books and be in the presence of Ambedkar's, collection. I look in the back of it, and there's a piece of scrap paper, just a folded piece, had a big ink blot on it. He loved his fountain pens. Yeah. So, but then, you look closer at that scratch paper, and I started seeing his name. He was signing his name, practicing his autograph. Yeah. And you think about it, right? And, I have a blog post folks can find out there on this. I think it's called Finding Ambedkar's Signature. But I put a bunch of the pictures of his signature, and it changes over the years. The one on the Constitution is not when he was a student, he had a couple different signatures, so he's experimenting. This is one thing I see about his pragmatism. It's about self-creation. That's what he does when he says, I'm going to become a Buddhist, and a Buddhist in the way that I want to see Buddhism played out. So it's a reclaiming of human personality, not just I have to follow something else. So same for your signature. There's not one way to sign it. Why don't you explore and find the way that speaks to you? So he does that with his signature. And then right below it, you see him signing John. And, he's signing Dewey's name. So, right there from 1914, he's kind of just taken by something with this bumbling American philosophy professor, for better or worse. I know some folks in Indian academics that study Ambedkar want to tell me, shut up, enough on Dewey. Just keep talking about Ambedkar. And, that's fine. Everyone can talk about what they want. There's space for all of us. But there's something unique about Dewey. We found no documents where he's sitting there doodling Seligman's autograph or his visage. And so Dewey's on his mind. And it's not just in a mindless sense. Like, I got to be like this dude. And I found no evidence ever of an attempt from Dewey to write a letter to Ambedkar, or from Ambedkar to write a letter to Dewey, or arrange a visit. So it's a fascinating relationship. It's distanced. It's one way largely, to the shame of Dewey. Dewey should have learned something from Ambedkar when he was sitting in his class, but it is what it is. And so it's a fascinating intellectual relationship. And through his whole life, Ambedkar kept tabs on what Dewey was doing, largely through his books. I found reading notes where Ambedkar writes down a summary of what Dewey's recent book in the 1940s is about, and then he writes down 2 other books from 1949. And so, so he's keeping tabs on what Dewey's doing as late as the 1950s. It's fascinating. He never writes Dewey because probably that wouldn't give him what he wants, ideas to work with and to change and to do something with. And writing Dewey might give you how's the family? What have you been up to? That sort of low information.
And I think that comes across really well in the book as well. There's almost a Spartan relationship between the teacher and the student, where they're not really talking, but there's clearly a sense of contact. And talking about just Ambedkar and the way he was changing and the way he was experimenting, I think that's such a wonderful theme across all of India's founding fathers, be that Gandhi, be that Nehru, be that Ambedkar. They're constantly changing. The Gandhi comes in with his own set of prejudices, biases, and then we see the person evolve over the years. The same with Nehru, same with Patel, same with Ambedkar. And even if a lot of times these people did not see eye to eye, the constant theme of changing and that whole Walt Whitman idea of I contain multitudes is very evident across all of these. Particularly between John Dewey and Ambedkar. You mentioned that there has been some criticism across you overstating Dewey's importance in Ambedkar. We were discussing Professor Mahanand's article in The Hindu, which also makes a similar point. So what is that? What would be your answer or your rejoinder to that criticism that Dewey's influence on Ambedkar is being overstated, and a lot of things which Ambedkar did were really just, born out of his own experiments which happened in India, and Dewey was sort of an afterthought, if any?
Yeah, and Mahanand's article is useful because it kind of reminds me of what these criticisms were, and frankly, I gave my response to an earlier version of those in the EPW article. So he says he's responding to the EPW article, but I don't quite see the response. But the response is this, right? When we call Ambedkar a Buddhist, do we exclude something like a politician? He's a politician, or he's an activist, or he's an anti-caste intellectual. We don't. No one would get mad at someone talking about Ambedkar as a Buddhist and say, no, he's not a Buddhist. So it strikes me as weird that we do that with pragmatism. And, the idea that, I want to think about is, what are we building in to that demur that maybe isn't legitimate? And I think it's the idea that pragmatism, is a school of thought that has certain concrete, commitments that exclude other schools of thought with other concrete commitments. And I think that's absolutely false. If folks take the effort to read the pragmatist tradition to any extent, you'll see Peirce looks nothing like James. I find James much more exciting. I find Peirce boring. Both of those two thinkers look a lot different than Jane Addams or Mary Kingsbury Simkovich or John Dewey. Yet all these people are in that tradition. They're reading each other. They're doing, Dewey is on the board for a little bit, or he works with Simkovich's settlement house, Greenwich House. It's kind of like Jane Addams, but it was in New York. I'm convinced that Ambedkar went there and saw Greenwich House, but I'm still putting that together. Her husband was Vladimir Simkovich, who Ambedkar took 5 classes with.
Yeah.
But at any rate, I think part of the worry is if you call someone a Vedantin, they can't be a Buddhist, or you call someone a Buddhist, they cannot be a Jain. I think that's the mindset that some take. And so I understand what they're getting at. We don't want to exclude stories or aspects of Ambedkar that matter just for the Dewey story. But on the other hand, I'm just at a loss to see why I'm doing that. I mean, my book is on the historical and conceptual relationship between Dewey and Ambedkar. So obviously there's going to be a lot of Dewey in that. I can't talk about everyone at the same level of depth. In my next work, I'm going to be focusing more on Ambedkar as a theorist of democracy. There'll be some Dewey in that, but it won't be the intense historical textual story that you see in this one. Probably people will find a new way to complain about too much Dewey in that too. So, the bottom line is that, when you tell a story about Dewey and Ambedkar, you're going to have a lot of Dewey in there. So, I don't know why the people think it's making Ambedkar subservient to the Westerner. And then second of all, at the conceptual level, I try to maintain this, in a lot of my work, especially recently. When you talk about him as a pragmatist, the question is, does this occlude or exclude certain things, or does it bring to light new things? So, for instance, take his Buddhism. And one of the key discoveries in my book was that Adlerblum recollection. She had an audio recording. She was a student of Dewey's, and she records her recollections, and she's there with Dewey in the 1910s. And no one ever has noticed this, and I finally noticed it because I, am looking for Ambedkar-related stuff in the Dewey archives. And what she says, remembering 50 years after the fact, she says, in the 1910s, there was this one student of Dewey's from India, who was fascinated with caste. And to me, that's already, sticks out because no one in American universities was like taking up the torch of caste. It was always self-rule, independence. So, and then she says he would imitate Dewey. And it almost seemed like he was there. Well, from Ambedkar's second wife, Savita, she recalled to Vijay Sarwade and others that, Ambedkar used to have this impersonation of Dewey. And so, but in that recollection, and I talk about this in my book, she says this student from India was, so he was interested in Buddhism, but he, this is like 1914, he was interested in Buddhism, but he thought that Dewey's philosophy of democracy might have more to promise the untouchables than Nirvana would. And he says he was searching for a way to bridge Dewey's philosophy with Buddhism. So that's going to be, something I explore more and more in my, future work. When you say Ambedkar's Buddhism and you say Ambedkar's pragmatism, are you pointing to two different things? I think in one way, his pragmatism was largely a combination of Dewey on democracy as a way of life and what he saw as valuable in the Buddhist tradition. So that's one way to get at what we're talking about when we talk about his pragmatism. It's traditional Buddhism plus this stuff on democracy as a way of life. Does that make us ignore Ambedkar, see a different Ambedkar that doesn't make sense? No, that's what Mahanand is talking about when he says Buddhism is emancipatory, but it just has a historical depth to it. The idea that what is emancipatory about it? It's the jamming together of this view of democracy with the tradition of Buddhism that doesn't foreground democracy as a way or habit of life. So knowing that historical story about Ambedkar and Dewey, you start to see new things about his Navayana Buddhism. That's kind of my point here. So I keep telling folks, someone needs to tell all these stories about what he heard in Seligman's classes. Someone out there has Seligman's notes. Find them. And tell me that story. Someone needs to. I've dug up a little bit on Shotwell, another teacher. No one's noticed this, but in one of Shotwell's big books, there's a footnote where he talks about a student of his who used to bring up caste in his class, Bimrao Ambedkar. So I wrote a blog post on it because it wasn't really part of my book project. But there's all this stuff to be told, and I think it's absolutely silly when people say, you talk too much about Dewey, talk about all these other people. No, it's better if we all pick a path and go down it as far as we can. That's kind of my mindset.
you could do so many other books on different people. There's no dearth of books, there's no dearth of things to be said. And this is so interesting. I wish someone is listening out there and actually starts doing like a series of famous people in school, and you have Ambedkar's time in Columbia, you have Nehru's time in Cambridge and all of that, and it's about what were these people doing. Did Nehru have like an impersonation of some teacher he was doing? Was Gandhi doing something similar in wherever? But this is fascinating. So Dr. Stroud, my penultimate question, once Ambedkar goes away, of course, there's a whole legacy which he leaves behind, then a bunch of other politicians come in, the freedom project, as it were, essentially keeps going on. Where do you see pragmatism in that in that whole journey? What happens to pragmatist thought in India after Ambedkar? Who were the other thought leaders who were sort of doing similar work in a similar way?
Yeah. And this is something that I need to learn a lot more about. So for instance, Kanchiram is, I have his biography up here somewhere, and he's one of these fascinating figures that kind of gains a wider appeal, like Ambedkar was able to kind of reach a lot more people than others in his role might have reached. And so, now the question is, did that, legacy, including folks like Kanchiram, did they read the pragmatists and, kind of bring these ideas explicitly into their, I'm not sure. They clearly read Ambedkar, and Ambedkar clearly read people like Dewey. So there's kind of a distancing effect. As the tradition moves on, they find more immediate sources of inspiration and ideas to appropriate and change. And so is there pragmatism in that movement? In one sense, yes. I mean, they probably are getting from Ambedkar the idea that you need to be flexible and focus on purpose. And you create some political arrangement, and then when it doesn't suit you anymore or suit the needs of the community, feel free to change it. Don't be mindlessly adherent to it like it's the way that God ordained you, make up society. So they might get that sense of pragmatist flexibility in that. Did they get appreciation for Dewey's strengths and limitations on, philosophy and epistemology like Ambedkar did? No, I don't think that's Kanchiram's project, but I may be wrong. So this is the challenge is, I'm focused on Ambedkar, but so many other people got to pick up the torch. And there's also this question of, kind of a conceptual question, right? And this is, I think, what some people got misled, or not misled, but they got, I'm so focused in a lot of my book on the historical question. And by the last chapter, I look at the conceptual connection of Ambedkar to pragmatism. But if you don't make it to the last chapter, you just get, it's all about the historical borrowing from Dewey. But the kind of, the question of what could we do in India, philosophically, practically, if we take people like Dewey seriously, as people to take from, to refute, to argue with. And so that's the next phase that I've been working with the John Dewey Society. Their journal, Dewey Studies. It's an online open access journal. I'm, as I speak, putting together a special issue on Dewey in India. And some of those pieces will be on Vivekananda and Dewey, let's say. Some of those pieces will be on Ambedkar. But that's the next question is, India, like the US, is very concerned about democracy, very concerned about education, very concerned about technology and education. Dewey and the pragmatists in the West are speaking to this as well. So the West needs to learn about Ambedkar and, his views on things like democracy and stratification and fraternity. And the people in the West or in India can learn from some of these folks in America talking about pragmatism and education. So some of those will be historical frameworks, but some of those will be conceptual frameworks. What can we learn, applying this to that? So that kind of synthesis, that synthetic urge, that's what Dewey died having penned in Philosophy East and West. And I think that's what a lot of us interested in Ambedkar should start doing, which is, what new connections can we make between these traditions?
It was wonderful. And I'm curious this sounds very interesting. And I'm really thinking out loud that at that time, while other leaders like Gandhi or Nehru or Rajaji, they might not have read Dewey, but in their lived reality, they were sort of exemplifying a lot of pragmatist thought in terms of how they were negotiating, what were their political activism, what were their individual philosophies. So I'd be curious to see if there is any relation there, that it wasn't just Ambedkar, but others who also sort of knew about the philosophy, though they might not have been as academically inclined as Ambedkar was, which, I mean, even within amongst all the founding fathers, Ambedkar was a slight exception in the amount of things he had studied, right? His whole idea that education is like a tigress's milk, which he says with so much poetic flourish. The Ambedkar is absolutely the poster boys for what education can do to you.
But actually that line is fascinating. That was in Muk Nayak. He said,
Yeah.
English is the tigress's milk.
Oh.
Learning the language of English allowed him to access all these different views on things, including, is caste really from the mind of God, or Varna from the, the divine source? And so yeah, Ambedkar loved education, but he especially loved ways of doing education that broke out of ways, and he saw that in the English. And so yeah, if you read Muknayak, it's fascinating. His target in many ways is Gandhi more than the English, and so this has a whole legacy of itself. But yeah, that question of what do we do with Ambedkar? Do we tell the same stories? Someone has to tell those stories so we don't forget them. But how can we generate new stories about Ambedkar? Okay, so we all got a part to play in this. For instance, Nehru came to John Dewey's 1949 birthday. It's like his 80 or 90th, like right before Dewey's about to die. And Nehru shows up at the last moment and gives a quick speech. This is all preserved. You can find it online. But Nehru said, whenever I have a moment of turmoil, or I don't know what to do, I turn to Dewey's texts. So apparently, Nehru even read him. But no, I don't know what he read. I don't know how much he read. I don't know what books he owned. I don't know if he underlined them. Some people own books but never read them. Some people read books but never really underline them. So this is an interesting thing I've figured out, is that like Ambedkar owned over 22 books by Dewey, and he underlined the heck out of them. And other books, he didn't seem to read. And he even says to his, advisors in their biographies, he's strategic. He wants to look at just the chapter that he needs, and then he moves on to something else. So at any rate, I don't know what the deal is with Nehru and Dewey, but someone out there needs to take that torch up and, spell out Nehru and what he knew and what he thought of Dewey. So I don't know. There's so many things to focus if you just are open to the idea of Ambedkar and Indian thought and American pragmatism.
Yes, amazing. So I had just one last question, but I'll still do one quick question. Is then, do you underline your books? You have a bunch of books. Do you underline them? Do you stamp them? What do you do with your books?
Yeah, I underline them. I don't sign them, but yeah, I do. My wife one year for Christmas got me a stamp, that kind of embossed. But yeah, I see. One time when I was an undergraduate, I had a teacher, that taught a history of philosophy class, and he died. And then, years later, when I was, roaming the streets of Berkeley when I was in the Bay Area, I went to the bookstore and I bought a book, and it had his stamp inside of it. And I think that really impressed on me that, I wasn't trying to find his works, but I stumbled across this connection, and I was able to see that connection. So yeah, I stamp most of mine. I underline, the ones that I'm doing. And, now I realize kind of what you're doing with that. You're trying to preserve the most useful things. But, use depends on projects. And so sometimes I'll read a book and I'll say, oh, that was when I was writing this article, because I notice all the things I was underlining, the pattern, the constellation. So these are historical traces. And the nice thing about Ambedkar is he loved underlining his books. And, that lets people like me or Christopher Queen or whoever look at those books and write something on, something new about Ambedkar, because everyone could read what he published and you can see what he cited there. But how do you get beyond that? One way to get beyond that is to see what texts were in the background and what he ignored, what he thought valuable enough to underline. And one of the fascinating things about Ambedkar is you look at his books. This is how I was able to find that one in Siddharth College's student stacks. He has a very distinctive way of underlining. He'd use colored pencils, red and blue and gray. And I think the gray, a lot of his student days, he was using gray because he couldn't afford the fancy pencils. But, one of the questions was always, what's his pattern of, what does red mean? What does blue mean? And I've talked to, his grandsons, they still live at Rajgraha, but they said, he had these tables all around Rajgraha, his big house. Really, it was a house built for his library. And, he would just grab a book and read, but at those tables, there'd be different colored pens. And so, that was kind of deflating to me. He doesn't have a code breaker. Red means he disagrees with that line. But, what it means, though, is some of these passages, you'll see a gray line in the margin, you'll see a blue underlining, you'll see red underlining. What that means is he read that passage, that book and that passage at least 3 times, because we have the physical marks of his engagement with it. So I don't do that. Usually I read one thing and I underline it and I think I'm done. But, Ambedkar's life and practice, gives the lie to that, which is, every reading is a fresh reading and our engagement with it has a history. And so you look at his beautiful annotations and you see what he has a history with. And it's wonderful that we can still see this today.
This is fascinating. I've never thought of thinking about annotations as being a legitimate lens to recreate historically some person who lived in the past. But the next time I'm at the Harry Ransom Center, I'll probably sort of be on the lookout for that. But Dr. Stroud, my final question, which I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. Now, you're clearly someone who's read a lot, who's engaged with art, both through Dewey and not through Dewey. So for the listeners and for me, recommend movies, books, music, perhaps, which means a lot to you and you would want a lot more people to engage or discover.
Yeah, I've always loved the work of Terrence Malick. You know, he's a very philosophical director. I heard that he was a student of a well-known philosopher at Berkeley. So he's very reclusive, but I always loved some of his work, like The Thin Red Line. And, you know, this is when a lot of people don't like it, and a lot of people don't like war movies. And that movie has a narrator doing a more abstract philosophical rumination as the war movie narrative plays out. So, you know, it's a jarring aesthetic experience. It calls upon you to figure it out. I've written stuff in my past where I engage it from the lens of the Bhagavad Gita, because the Gita is a story about war, but it's also a philosophical rumination about ethics and the metaphysics of ethics. So I don't know, you know, some of Terrence Malick's works might be, fun and thought-provoking, or tough and jarring and thought-provoking, but that kind of work is useful to us. And this is something to never forget about, right? Artworks aren't always self-contained. We bring a lot to them. So whatever movies you watch, try to find moments of puzzlement. Why is it doing that? I just watched Everything All at Once finally. And, I kind of like, well, a narrative works by being one dimension, yet here's something that tries to get all the multiverse in here, and that does violence to the narrative. And I can't quite decide whether it's a good movie or a bad movie because of that. But it at least got me to think about this and engage it from that perspective of narrative and argument and dimensionality. So yeah, these would be some of my mere recommendations.
What about books?
Oh, books. That's a sad thing about academics. They say, what did you read this summer? And you're like, well, what I had to read to write an article. So yeah, I have not read many books. One book I would recommend, to folks who want to know more about Ambedkar, read some of the biographies that are recently coming out on him. This is not fiction, but it's closer to literature in that sense than my boring drivel. But like Ashok Gopal's wonderful Apart, or Akash Ratore's Becoming Baba Sahib. These books are awesome. They're narrative in format. They tell a story, and they tell a story that correlates to a very valuable figure. So these would be some books I would recommend.
Wonderful. Yeah, Becoming Baba Sahib is amazing. I'll, of course, have all of these and all the films and the blogs that you've written linked in the show notes so that people can go into rabbit holes, discover so many more things. I think this has been absolutely amazing, Dr. Stroud. Thank you so much for taking out the time. We've gone a little past the limit, but, this was a great conversation. Of course, once I'm back at UT, I'll probably go and meet you in person, get my book signed by you as well. And can't wait to meet in person and talk more.
Well, thank you, Pranjal. And yes, in many ways, it's a big world. In many ways, it's a small world. I'm glad I met you via this podcast, and we'll meet up at UT, okay?
Absolutely.